Okay, well, Tim is gone today. He's on a little family business, so he's asked me to step in and chair the meeting, which I'm glad to do. So with that, I call this meeting to order. And the first order of business is pledge of allegiance. Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Today's budget day, it looks like. So, Jeremy, I'm just gonna say and away we go.
So first we'll look at the claims, and there's only 4 of them. The Baker Tilly, $1,687.50 is for the arbitrage report for the Airport Industrial Park bond
If I can
issue.
stop you for just a minute, my bad.
You didn't approve the minutes.
We need to.
Approve the minutes.
We need to approve the minutes. I was so focused on the budgets. Sorry, Jeremy.
Sorry.
You've all, I assume, read through the minutes. Are there any questions or disclaimers or denials, George?
I didn't see anything. Anybody else? With that, hearing no complaints, I'll go ahead and make a motion. We accept the minutes from June 5th as presented.
Thank you, George. I'll second it. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much, gentlemen. Okay, so with that, Jeremy, now I'll turn it over to you for the claims.
Like I said, the Baker Tilly, $1,687.50 is for the Airport Industrial Park bond issue reporting requirements. And Times Union, $20.68 is for the additional appropriation for the Lincoln project. Engineering Resources, Inc., $5,000 is for ongoing engineering work for the Sheldon Street project. And then Hyatt Palma, $13,750 is for the downtown action plan that we contracted with for earlier this year.
Does anyone have any input on these claims?
Look legitimate.
I move to accept all as presented.
There's a motion on the table. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, thank you, Bill. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Claims passed, Jeremy. 4-0.
So next up is the budgets. I'm not sure what comes first and
Salaries.
Salaries.
okay. So the salaries one actually kind of goes a little bit with redevelopment general, which I think is this 2 back yet, but I can go over just. So my wages are paid out of 4 different categories. Northern TIF pays for a portion, edit pays for a portion, sewage pays for a portion, and then the redevelopment general pays for a portion of my salaries. Whitney salary is paid out of edit and I believe redevelopment general, redevelopment, Northern TIF, and then the redevelopment general. Seeing that she doesn't have anything to do with sewage, none of her wages come out of sewage. So this just reflects the 3% increase as asked for by the mayor. That'll be presented to the council. Once budgets are presented, it includes the increase, projected increase in the insurance. Dental, I think, stayed the same. Perf did go up, or I should say it may go up. Perf is set for a number of years. That perf last was like 11.2%, and it was set 4 or 5 years ago, but will be reset, or could potentially change or be reset mid-2024. So we have no idea what that amount is, so we basically just added some additional funds in there to hopefully cover any change, if there is a change. That'll be done through the state. FICA stays the same, so that's just a percentage of the salary. And then life, LTD and AD&D stayed the same. Unemployment is just a cover in there for 2,000. So that's pretty much the only changes would be the 3% and then whatever comes from perf in 2024 to the salaries. Two of those will show up in, some will come out of redevelopment general and then the northern TIF budgets. So if there's no questions on that, I'll just get into the actual budgets.
Okay.
So the first one is Warsaw Technology Park. These are funds that we collect from sales tax and income taxes as they're allocated just within the technology park designation. Right now, we have a current balance at the end of 2022 of around 2.2 million. We had expected revenue of around 450,000 for 2023, which gave us a total funds of 2.6 million in 2023. You see this year's budget, which had us around a little over 1.2 million, which left us with a balance of around 1.4 million for next year. So if we look at expected revenue in 2024, around 450,000 gives us a total funds in 2024 of 1.9 million. And I've put that into 150,000 into engineering, 150,000 into property acquisition, and 1.5 million in capital outlays. Capital outlays allows us to do any kind of construction project. The other property acquisition is just a placeholder depending on whether or not we need to move money in and out of those categories as projects may come up. There's nothing necessarily designated for this other than we're still trying to figure out what that incubator innovation center looks like, where it's at, and how we accomplish that. So that's kind of what this money is being targeted for. So we don't have any obligations out of this fund. They're just purely capital projects that we can do for both the technology park or an innovation center.
Can you provide any examples of property acquisition when I looked at that way? Like what? It just sort of.
We could acquire, let's say someone came in tomorrow and said, we'd like to put a new plant here. We're going to hire 150 people and we're going to manufacture widgets. What incentive are you going to give it? We could do a property acquisition incentive where we give money through buying property, whether it be personal or equipment related. You know. Much like we've done on some of our other projects.
Okay, thank you.
On the capital outlays, Jeremy, we had $1 million in there this year.
Mm-hmm.
And have we used much of that money?
We have not used any of the money budgeted for this year.
Will that roll over?
Yeah,
Is that
if it doesn't get
1.5
spent,
comes in next year?
yeah, if it doesn't get spent, it just goes back into the fund.
Okay.
Yeah. All of these funds outside of redevelopment general are non-tax related, which means that unlike your general fund, which is based on the tax rate, these are based on the tax rate, but they don't directly impact the tax rate.
Mm-hmm.
So they go into their own fund, and then we spend money out of that fund, but that fund, all that money stays in that fund until there's none left.
Thank you. Any other questions down here, gentlemen? Anything else you want to?
No, I can just go through these, and then if you have questions on them at the end, we can, you can ask questions on them now, or you can ask them on the end. It doesn't matter to me.
Okay.
So we'll just kind of go through, and as questions pop in, feel free to ask. And then as we go at the end, if you still have a question on something, don't hesitate to stop me. So redevelopment general, now this is the tax rate-based budget. This is the only tax rate-based budget that we have, so it's based on, it's a percentage of the overall city rate. And so whatever that percentage is what it generates in revenue. So right now it's expected to generate around 200,000 in revenue. So we had a current balance in 2023 of $500,000. At the end of, or at the beginning of 2023, expect around 200,000. We had a budget this year of about $315,000, which left us around $385,000 for the end of this year. Based on having around $200,000 expected revenue for 2024, it gives us around $585,000 for a 2024 budget. Because this is our operating fund, the Redevelopment Commission's operating fund, we do try to keep those balances kind of so we have about the same amount of money in there in any given year. We do usually plan to put some money in infrastructure projects. So the budget, wages and benefits, a portion of my wages and Whitney's wages come out of here. So for next year is about $72,000. Office supplies come out of this budget, around $3,000. Professional services, put in there $30,000. Travel, $500. Printing, so any printing needs, we'd have $2,500 for printing. Your redevelopment bonds come out of this budget. So every year you guys have a bond that we are required per the state statute to purchase. So $500 for those bonds. Other services would be equipment, machinery, $6,500. And then unlike most of your districts where you're somewhat bound by each district, the redevelopment in general is not bound by any district. It covers the entire city. So we usually put around some money in for infrastructure projects. We have $150,000 in budget for next year, and this can be used for any project within the city. There's no boundaries for the use of these funds. Gives us a total budget around $265,000 for next year. The next one's even simpler because this will be the first year for the marketplace TIF. So next year will be the first budget year for that. Now, marketplace TIF is a insert to the larger Winona interurban, but it has its own boundaries. The only thing that would be coming out of here is those bond payments for that marketplace project. I'm expecting that revenue to be around $80,000. The bond payment is $75,480.25. So we hopefully get those funds in there to cover that bond payment that's due in July. Any shortfall would be covered by the developer per our agreement with them. They cover the first 5 years. We cover the last 5 years, so it's covered for 10 years. So any shortfalls in those bond issues would be paid by them.
Yes.
So expecting the revenue to cover those costs. If they don't, they would pay those costs for the first 5 years, and we would pay them for the next 5 years. So not a whole lot to go with that budget other than just making that bond payment. Redevelopment allocation is the downtown TIF district. Our current balance for end of 2022 was around $550,000. Expected revenue around $320,000. Gives us a total budget for 2023 of $871,000. 2023's budget had roughly $373,000 budgeted, including the Buffalo Street bond payment, and $150,000 in capital outlays, which would be for capital projects, which at the end of 2023 gives us around $497,000 in funds. With the expected revenue of around $320,000 for 2024, we're back at around that $817,000 in total funds. We've got $50,000 for professional engineering, our professional services, $5,000 as a placeholder for property acquisition. Capital outlays, we put around $400,000 for capital projects, and then we have our bond payment of $165,500. Gives us a total budget of $620,500 for 2024. The $400,000 would be subject to projects within that district. So to give you an example of projects, Owens, Buffalo Street, mixed use both could be recipients of those funds going forward.
The bond payment, how long is that going to be?
20 years. So we try to double cover that bond payment, which is why you see we still have about we have enough to cover any payments next year. So if no revenue were to come in next year, we would still have enough leftover revenue to cover that bond payment for the following year.
Okay.
That's not to say we're going to spend the $400,000. Any money that doesn't get spent stays into that fund. So if you look back through some of our budgets, you'll see some years the budgets will increase, some years they'll go down. A lot of that's based on whether or not we do projects in one year. So if we do a large project next year, then the following year there won't be much money left for project funds. And as those funds are available for projects, they may ebb and flow, go up and down, depending on how much money we spend.
Your capital outlay went up 350,000 for next year. Any explanation for that or not?
Which one?
150 to 400,000 capital outlays, redevelopment allocation.
Yeah, so if you look at, like I said, our budgets will go up and down. So 2022's budget was 723,000. 2023's was 375. So money that is allocated in 2023, whether we spend it or not, can't be budgeted for 2024 because it's assumed spent. So when we have a down year like this year, we only had 150,000. It was because last year we had more money budgeted. Now, whether or not we spend that or not will dictate what happens the following year. So even though we budgeted 400,000 this year, doesn't mean we'll spend 400,000 next year. Say we spend 200,000, that money will be in that budget for the entire year, which means we have less money to do planning for the following year. So some years we'll have more capital project money, other years we'll have less. Try to balance it as much as possible, but some of our projects require bigger capital, so some years we'll have more capital for those projects. This budget doesn't have a lot of income in it, not like the Northern TIF where we can budget every year $2 million in capital projects because we're generating that money every year. Northern residential TIF is 446. Current balance is around 230,000. Expected revenue. So this I did change. I sent both this one and the southern residential. I changed this afternoon. We did get the revenue, 50% of the revenue in for this year. So based on that revenue, I've made some changes to those budgets. Originally, I expected, I think, around 120,000 in revenue for this. Right now, we're looking like we might generate around 260,000. So if that's the case, we'll have more money available for next year for projects. So 2023, expected revenue around 260,000. Total funds for 2023 were around 490. We had a budget around 170, 150,000 for capital projects. Right now, that would include the subdivision that we're working on, Custer, and then some other projects within that district. Going to 2024, end of year, we have balance around 320,000, expected revenue around 280,000, gives us around 600,000 for funds in 2023. So I've put 35,000 in professional services and 300,000 in capital outlays. Those funds would be dedicated to residential development projects like Custer's or Bella Augusta, the third, fourth phase of Bella Augusta would be those two projects. We have a storm sewer project that we've committed to for Bella Augusta, and we've got a sanitary commitment to Custer's development off of Old 30.
Are they putting streetlights in these developments, and if so, who's paying for them?
Most do not anymore. I know years ago they used to put yard lights in.
Yeah.
But there was never any maintenance of those yard lights, and then a lot of them would get torn out or they would never be maintained. We've done some street lights, but we have not made it mandatory to do street
I think it's
lights.
important that, I don't know if we need to make it mandatory, but eventually, I've been around long enough, we've had requests from neighborhoods that didn't have streetlights.
Or need on
And
where
then they
the
come back
intersection-
later, years later, and say, hey, could you guys put in some streetlights for us? So shouldn't we consider maybe doing that on the front end and,
We could. I think that's a plan commission question, not necessarily for us, but for the plan commission. And I do think that that's something you can look at. It wasn't really an issue until everything went underground. Used to be your older subdivisions, you can drive through, you see utility poles, and so they
Right.
just put lights on the utility poles.
right?
Now everything's underground, so there's no more poles.
Yeah, I didn't
Which-
think of that.
I think that's been the challenge is we didn't do street lights because, we'll put some lights on the utility pole, problem solved. There's not utility poles anymore. So we ran into that on some of the mid-development subdivisions that happened post-utility poles. They started going underground and people wanted lights and we're like, how do we do this? Because there's no utility poles to put lights on. In the past, we would just we'd find a close utility pole to that intersection's proximity, put a light on it, problem solved. It's not the case anymore. So so you're not wrong.
Are you saying that all the utilities going in these new developments are all underground?
All underground.
Okay. Well, I think the last light that I remember putting in was out there on 200 South, just the first road west of Station 3.
Yep.
There's a road, and I forget the name of the road. I think its name started with a C. It doesn't matter, but, and we had a request, and we put a light there because the intersection was hard to
Right.
see.
I remember that.
Yeah.
You were part of that.
Yeah.
You got the
And
complaint.
And to me, it's just, forward thinking to maybe require at least some lights at intersections. Because if you don't have any lights out there, it's dark. So-
Yeah, and I think that's a legitimate question. I think the Plan Commission would address.
So how, should we make
I'm on the plan commission.
maybe
I'll
make a
ask
formal request from us to Plan
Study it,
Commission to
yeah.
consider
Justin.
requiring?
Yeah, and I think, I don't think, because then the city has to pay for those lights, so keep that in mind.
Well, that's why I'm asking, should we start
So I think
maybe
if you're
putting
gonna-
that in our budgets, or would
I
that
think
money
you-
come from somewhere else, or?
I think it could come from these funds.
Okay.
Say, if we were mandating a developer put in lights and he says, it's not that I don't want to put in lights, but I can tell you, the projects we've done lights on, very expensive. Like, not cheap.
Right.
Like, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, just like, we're looking at Sheldon Street right now. If we do lights out there, we're probably in the neighborhood of $400,000 to put street lights.
Mhm.
They're not cheap.
Mhm.
So I can see that there's gonna be a lot of pushback from developers on that.
Yeah,
So I don't think we need to go to the point of lighting a neighborhood. I think what we do is light intersections that we think may have
Dark.
issues.
at a minimum, yeah,
At a
just
minimum.
light, have a light at
So
each
maybe
intersection.
your 3 lights in a subdivision.
Yeah.
Now, the challenge there becomes whether I put in 3 lights or 10 lights, it doesn't change the cost, especially if you're talking about, having $15,000 just to set the first light. And it's $5,000 for another light after that, right? So
Yeah.
some of it's got to be reasonable too, so we have to think about, well, if I'm going to set a location for this, how many lights can I get? Can I get 3 or 4 subdivisions off of one pedestal? Or am I spending $15,000 on a pedestal, put 3 lights in, then going a mile down the road, have to spend another $15,000 on a pedestal, put 3 lights in?
Yeah,
There's a lot of thought that goes into it, but I do think that's something the Planning Commission could look at and really start to say, okay, if we're going to do some of this, maybe what we're looking at is the main intersections with, if we have a subdivision entrance, maybe that entrance needs to be lit, and how
Yes.
do we light it safely? I
'cause
don't
that's
know that.
always a problem, when the entrance to a subdivision isn't lit. They either need a lighted sign, or.
Yep. So I think
That's
that
the
this definitely would be a Plan Commission
Yeah.
question, and I definitely think it could be something that could be paid for as a development
Okay,
incentive.
So
for
can we
instance.
make a formal request to them to, look at it and explore
Yep.
options or possibilities?
I'm a member of that, all that,
Right.
Justin.
Right, but I didn't want you to have to go out there by yourself and say, hey,
Nothing wrong with
but if
studying
if
or
it comes
seeing
from
if
this
we can-
board, if we
Yeah.
think it's something worth looking at.
Yeah. I know that some of the older ones did have lights, then they went to the yard lights, went away from street lights.
Mm-hmm.
Now they've gone away from yard lights, which wouldn't have been an issue, but now all the utility lines are underground, so you don't have any poles to
Right,
put lights
the
on.
lights.
Yeah.
And then it's up to the individual to maintain those poles, and some people
They
do,
don't.
some people don't, some people put in really
Yeah.
bright lights, some people put in no lights.
Some people
so
turn
it's-
them on, some
it's
people don't turn them
hexy-kexy,
off.
hit and miss.
Yeah, it's really, yeah, I agree. So that's something the planning commission can definitely look at.
Okay, sorry I got off on a tangent, but when I saw these numbers and capital outlays and stuff, I thought, well, maybe this is the place to talk about that. Thank you.
So much like the northern residential, the southern residential TIF, I did increase a little bit as the revenue projections were a little bit higher, not as high as the northern one, but a little bit higher. Current balance around 100,000, expected revenue for 2023 around 220. Gave us a total funds available for 2023 of 318. We have 100,000 in this year's budget, 50,000 professional services, 50,000 in capital outlays. Gave us an end of year balance around 218 with roughly expected revenue of 230,000 in 2024. Gave us a total funds on hand of almost 450,000 in 2024. So we've put 50,000 in professional services and 200,000 in capital outlays. Those funds would be set aside for the lift station and the southern residential subdivision we're working on, which would be an expansion of the Granite Ridge subdivision, Park Ridge. So those funds, there's a road down there that we want to extend to 200, and then we've got $1.5 million in a lift station. So those are what those funds are earmarked for. The big one, redevelopment Northern TIF, current balance in 2023 around 6.4 million. Expected revenue for 2023 around 3.1, gives a total funds of around 9.6 for 2023. So portions of myself and Whitney's salaries come out of this budget. So 102,500 is allocated for salaries in 2023. And then you see all the bonds and the sewer pledges. And we had roughly 200,000 in infrastructure projects for this year. Those funds are being spent on the airport lift station and Sheldon Street, the projected use of those funds. Total expenditures for 2023 is around 3.8, leaves us a year-end balance of 5.7. So going into 2024, with projected revenues around the same, 3.1 million, we have about 8.8 million in total funds. Salary, once again, is around 102,500. We have our bond pledge for the sewage project of 600,000. We've got the 3 Winona PVD bond issues, Thompson Thrift bond payment, the Airport Industrial Park bond payment. We've allocated about 900,000 for professional services. Have 5,000 for property acquisition, which is a placeholder, and then 3.5 million for infrastructure projects. Gives us a total budget of just over 6 million for 2024. The 900,000 for professional services. Obviously, we have our ongoing projects and some engineering needs there, but a bulk of that money will go towards the CE for Anchorage Road, which is our construction inspection requirement for that NDOT project. Those funds will be reimbursed 80 to 20, but we got to spend out all of it. We'll get reimbursed 80% of that money back. Projects for next year, we have the Airport Industrial Park project that we're working on. We have the Petro Drive project that we talked about our last meeting. Depending on whether or not we get the Sheldon Street out on the street yet this year or later this year, some of those monies could be split for the Sheldon Street project and other infrastructure projects that might come up during the year. So a little bit larger budget for infrastructure projects, but some of it may get spent, some of it might not. It depends on how much we get done next year. But we have a pretty busy schedule, so we'll see how successful we are. Leaves us around 2.8 million. This does not include the $1 million that is invested. So we actually have closer to 3.8 million in those funds that'd be available for the next year, which means that we still double cover all of our bonds. Our bond payment coverage is right around 1.2 million every year. So keeping that additional funds in there to cover those bonds.
And that's in the balance.
Yes. The last one, redevelopment, Winona Interurban. This one doesn't generate a lot of money. We had roughly 64,000 for beginning of 2023. It's generating around 24,000, which gave us 88,000 for 2023. 2023's budget had 20,000 professional services and 30,000 in capital outlays, a total budget of 50,000, which left us a balance of 38,000 for 2024, plus the 26,000 in revenue, gives a total of 64,000 on hand. Put in 20,000 professional services and 40,000 for capital outlays. Those 40,000 could be set aside for the GACI project, or any other project in that district. It could also be set aside to make any shortfall payments that might happen on a Market Street bond if any would occur. Even though it's not our coverage yet, that money could be set aside for that in the future. There's no bond obligations at this point in time, but keep in mind we are proposing to issue a bond for the GACI development this year.
Jeremy, is the Arnold project in this district?
Yes.
I thought so. Okay, so when it comes online in 2024, wouldn't that expected revenue go
Start
up
to
more
increase.
than just $2,000 from this year?
Well, we've given it a tax abatement,
Okay.
so it will, but it will slowly increase over the
It won't be
next,
reflected next year, is what you're saying.
not immediately. So it'll have 100% tax abatement its first year,
Okay.
90%, 80, 70, 60,
Okay.
50,
Okay.
40. yeah,
Standard
down the line.
operating
Yep.
tax abatement procedure, okay. Just
That
wanted to-
crossed my mind, so I was gonna ask that. I thought, well, there'd be a little income, but I forgot.
So yes, it will start to increase,
Okay.
but it'll be incremental as that tax abatement rolls off.
Are you gonna ask approval for these budgets today, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And it's okay that we call that 3% salary increase as part of the budget, just because it
Yeah,
hasn't
ultimately-
technically been approved?
Yes, technically, these are your budgets, you approve them, but I still present them to the council, and the council still approves these budgets, but technically, you're the body that approves these budgets, yes. But if the council doesn't pass a salary increase, it doesn't happen,
Definitely.
because the salary ordinance falls under their purview. So if they approve so it doesn't matter what you approve in terms of salary,
Yeah.
if they don't approve it, then it doesn't happen.
And it's okay that we had it in there.
So since he brought it up, I'm gonna go back to the last budget, 4448, because I
Yep, no.
didn't see a 3% increase in the salary from 23 to 24. It was 102.5 in both years, so.
Yeah, when I ran the numbers, I usually inflate it a little bit just to cover anything unknown, like your health insurance or whatever, because technically we don't know what those costs will be until, and I had enough gap in there to cover that, so I didn't change the dollar amount.
Okay. That's the way you want to do it.
Yeah, it wasn't a big enough change for me to change anything in there, so I didn't change it. So there's still a little bit of cushion in there. It's probably a little bit less than last year, but still enough that I'm not.
Okay.
I only have 2 people. If I
Yeah.
had a much larger budget, I might be a little bit, or I had more employees, I might be a little bit more concerned about, oh, she leaves and then someone else comes in, or I have 2 people leave and one was single and didn't have family insurance, and then the next one comes in and has family insurance. But because we're only 2 people, I don't have those concerns, quite like some other departments have where they may have bigger changes.
Okay. So when do you need approval? We're done with all the budgets now. Okay. When do you need that today, or you need us to kick it around and come to you with any questions, or?
You can't, usually what I do is I'll turn these into Lynn. So in the past, we haven't had 2 meetings, so I present them to you in July for your approval.
Uh-huh.
You can approve them now, or we can approve them at the July meeting. it doesn't matter to me. I'm gonna give these to Lynn, subject to your approval, and then when you approve them and sign them, then I'll give her the signed copies. But you can absolutely approve them today, or you can approve them July 10th. The one thing I will say is only 3 of you are gonna be here July 10th.
Well, I
so-
was just gonna say,
Yeah. And Tim's still not going to be here,
I'll
so.
take the floor for just a minute because there are 4 of us here that vote. Next month, there will be 3 of you here that
Let's make
vote.
a
So I would probably suggest since we're a quorum here, that
We should.
probably just go
It's all,
ahead.
it's all
probably-
recommendation anyway, but
Yeah,
that this is what we're recommending to council.
Okay,
Yeah.
Yep.
okay. So, were you done with your presentation then? Jim?
Yes, so if there's any other questions or.
Did anyone have any questions? Anybody? Any
Good, Mike.
questions?
Good.
What's for lunch?
Well, hearing none, and like Jeff said, they are proposals basically of budgets, but I will make a motion that we accept and approve the budgets as presented today, from salaries all the way down to the Wyndham Manor Urban. Or do you want me to read them all? All the budgets,
I
yeah.
don't need to, no.
Items.
I'll second. A through I.
Yeah, it's A through I.
Bill, did you second that?
I'll second.
Bill seconded that.
Okay. Any further discussion, anyone?
Good.
Okay, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of approving the budgets as presented today by Jeremy, indicate by saying aye.
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 Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, Jeremy, budgets pass unanimously to be forwarded to the city council, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Good idea.
Okay, I guess we're gonna skip over item 2.
Yes, I know I had that on here. We didn't quite, I put it on here because I didn't know if I was gonna get it ready enough, have it ready or have enough conversations with them to get it on this agenda. So I went ahead and put it on there. We did not get all of our answers or complete the LOI at this point, so we'll keep working on that and we'll kick it to the July meeting.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Any other business that may come before this board? Anyone have any concerns or thoughts or input? Anything from school? Awful quiet down there.
Just listening and watching.
Summer session.
Yeah, we're down to one meeting a month during the summer ourselves. So
Are you?
Nice.
Is it one?
so we're
Well,
combined.
good.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
So moved. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you for coming, everybody.
All right. Good job, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Good idea on that vote.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have some GACI stuff coming